I'm Sarah Craddock, I'm the editor of Southern Historian, and we're talking to Dr. Kate Brown today. Thank you for joining us today. We just wanted to ask you a couple of questions, even though you are a Soviet historian and not a historian of Southern history.
That's right.
But you do environmental history,
Right.
and you have graciously agreed to be our keynote speaker for the 9th annual Power and Struggle Conference. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thanks
to
for
see us.
having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So I'm just going to ask you questions that are related to graduate studies and your experience and any advice that you may have for graduate students.
Yeah.
So just to start out with, how did you get into history as a career? How did you go about, what was your journey as far as like deciding to, hey, maybe I should go to grad school for history? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the Soviet Union was falling apart, and I had a job from 1988 to 1991, and I was in all parts of the Soviet Union with this job, and I kept seeing the same scene happening over and over again. And the scene was something like, oh, they're digging up the courtyard of this monastery, and they found all kinds of skulls. Though that was where the NKVD shot 5,000 people in 1939 or something like that. And those kinds of scenes where people were digging into the past that had been repressed from, whatever, 1936 to 1986, and they were learning these things that they didn't know about their past, and they were appalled, and that mobilized people to join political parties and to run for office and to go stand in the street and shout and to change, to make major changes. And I realized then, wow, history has a lot of power. This isn't just an academic thing. This is something that really matters about how people feel about their communities and themselves today. And so I left that job and I went to grad school at the University of Washington for no other reason that I wanted to be in Seattle. And I didn't know anything about the history department. I was mostly doing like an international studies degree first for a master's, and then I gravitated towards history. And but mostly I was in grad school because I wanted to be a writer, and I could work as a freelance writer while I was in grad school, stretching out, working on my PhD for 9 years, and then do all these jobs. I worked for the radio station, I worked for the public TV station, I wrote scripts for films, I wrote for the press. And finally I decided that I couldn't really say what I wanted to say unless I said it in my own book, in basically an academic setting. Because editors are always, intruding, and often in very political ways, even in this democracy. So I guess I wanted more autonomy, and I traded that in what autonomy and what I had to say, but I traded that in for less exposure. So it was kind of liberating while I was in graduate school because I didn't expect to become a professor.
That's so
hiding
unusual.
out. I was hiding out. I was getting paid a little bit of salary, and I had insurance, and that's all I needed. So I did that, as I said, and then I could write grants. I could go to some cool place in the summer or for a semester and learn another language or whatever. And so it was great. I thought it was the best scam in the world. I'm telling you honestly. But and then I read for a year in anthropology, led by a grant, and I had been reporting, so I learned the skills of talking to people, which I thought was sort of missing in a lot of histories. Even contemporary histories, people don't go and talk to people, but you can also talk to people who live in the place where something happened, where people are no longer alive. So I wanted to write a dissertation as a travelogue, and I had sort of methodological reasons for that, because the place I was writing about in this book, Biography of No Place, was a place that used to be a multi-ethnic, thriving sort of borderland, and after 25 years, that was the story I was telling, almost nobody was left. And I had to go to other places to find the story of this one place. I had to travel to Kazakhstan and to Midwest of the United States and to Germany to find people to tell me a story about this no place that had become no place. So I thought that methodologically, the notion of traveling to tell a story about people who have been deported was good. But my advisors weren't crazy about the idea.
Well, that's an interesting question for graduate students. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with these relationships and figuring out what you want to do?
Yeah.
And networking and getting these grants too, at the same time, I'm sure you have to have recommendations.
Right.
How did that dynamic work for you?
I'm not a good person to ask, because I just bombed away. As I said, I wasn't committed to being a professor. So they'd say, you know, you can't write a first-person travelogue because you won't get a job. And I was like, that's okay, I don't want a job. People will read your book, but they won't cite it. And I was like, what do I care about citations? You know, I just wasn't involved in that academic thing at the time. It didn't matter to me. And so I guess that gave me a certain kind of freedom. And if you can, you know, if you can liberate yourself that way, I think your advisors eventually respect you for that. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, maybe it's time to get another advisor who listens better. And that's the good job. The job of a good advisor is not to tell you what to do, but to listen to what you want to do and help you make that happen.
Well, on that note, now that you are a professor after all, even though you didn't care to be one,
right.
Oh, wow, people are going to hate you for that.
Oh, sorry. It was a long time ago.
But how do you go about, now that you advise other people, I mean, learning from your past experiences, what is your approach? How do you advise your students about their projects? Do you try to reel them in? Do you let them, how far, you know, how far do you let them go and wander or do their own thing?
Yeah, my tendency is to let them go and wander and bring back what you've got. But I realize other students want deadlines and need more sort of hands-on. So I guess it has to do, you know, I advise people based on the personality of the advisee a lot. And I don't think I'm an amazing advisor, but I try. I sometimes think, oh, I would love to write that story, but I try not. I try not to give too much advice, like, well, you should really do this, or this is your ideas, or I try to hold back from that because that's something somebody should come to on their own and make it their own. But I definitely want to see students develop a voice that's unique and their own, and I'd like to see stories told in a way that have to do with the content of the story.
Yeah.
So form is content. Content is form, right? So if you're telling a story about nuns in a convent, maybe you want to try to think of a way of telling a story that feels like a labyrinth and cloistered.
Yeah.
However, you know, that the boilerplate, this is what I'm going to tell you. Now that I've told you this, let me tell you what I just told you, that maybe that boilerplate isn't working. And we need to have more independence in the kinds of, and the way we tell the stories we tell.
Let's go from there to talk about your writing style, how you develop that, and like, what is your, I guess, methodology? Do you have a schedule? How have you improved? I mean, just to give some an idea, like a roadmap for young historians or even just writers generally. How do you develop those skills? Do you have any advice?
Well, I like Oscar Wilde has that famous quote, right? You probably know it. I only write when I feel muse speaks, and that's at 8 o'clock every morning. And I'm a little like that. I just get up and I just start writing, or I start working at it. Sometimes it doesn't, I at least start researching. I do something. I'm very protective of that time in the morning to have, and that's just my way of doing it. But I trained myself to be a writer, I think consciously. One way was when I was in graduate school, I took courses in writing short stories. Not because I wanted to be a fiction writer, but because I wanted to know how to write dialogue. And I wanted to know what made up a narrative arc. And what were the portals to getting into a story. I wanted to know the mechanics of what good writing is. And so I thought, fiction writing, I didn't see, there wasn't anything like creative nonfiction. That would have been a good option, but there wasn't any choice like that, so I just took fiction writing. And that was fun, and I learned a lot doing that. And then I wrote for the press, and I learned a lot from editors who'd be like, that sentence is too long, or where's your graph, in your first, that kind of thing. So I think I consciously, tried to figure out how to be a writer, also by keeping a journal every day about my own life, but then as I was researching, keeping a sort of research notes about interesting things that I hadn't known that I had learned that day and why I was so amazed by what I had learned. Because later on you assimilate that information and the awe and the astonishment or the horror or the terror that you feel goes away. And this just becomes a fact that you relate to your reader, but then it's kind of dry. So I like to preserve the discoveries as I'm making them. I can go back to those notes and write that into my text. And then I always like to go to the places that I'm writing about and just start asking questions. Then I take notes about what it looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like.
Who do you ask when you go? Like you just say, I'm going to go to a city and I'm just going to.
Well, it depends what the
walk
topic
in to
is.
get your espresso like you were talking about earlier, just ask them.
No. Usually I have a specific mission.
Yeah.
Like if I'm finding out about some nuclear accident, I want to talk to people who worked in the plant. And I want to talk to people who lived next door, and I want to talk to the bosses. I want to talk to the working class people. I want to talk to the guy who hunts and fishes. Like that kind of stuff.
And they're usually really receptive.
Oh, everybody wants to talk about their lives.
Yes.
Almost everybody.
So that makes it easy, I guess.
Yeah.
But languages must be definitely. How many languages do you speak then? Is it?
I really only speak Russian, and I know some Ukrainian and Polish and some German. And so when the villagers start speaking in a kind of a hybrid language, I've recorded it, and then I often have to go back and study it.
Yeah. Well, going from there, let's maybe talk about your last book, the one we don't have here. We don't have a copy of it over here.
Yeah. That book I wrote because when I was finishing up Plutopia, my editor wanted to cut out the first person parts of that book. And, the editor said, you really can't be a character in your own history.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, why not? Who said? And so I did not follow that advice, and I left the first person in Plutopia. But then after, in responding to that criticism or comment, I sent an email, and that email became the introduction to the next book called Dispatches from Dystopia, that is about, asking these so why as either social sciences or historians, and more specifically, do we have this discipline where we purport to tell the truth, but at the center of it is this big lie that we're not there. We pretend we're not there when we're doing the research, when we're writing the story, when we're emoting or feeling, all of that is gone. And I want to know why. And so this book is so if we allow the writer to exist in nonfiction, prose, then what happens? What do we learn by being there? I wanted to call the book Being There, but evidently that was already taken by Peter Sellers' movie. So if you're there, all kinds of things happen. And what I often do in the first person parts of my prose, and specifically in this book, is I show how I make mistakes. And I do culturally insensitive things, and I have the wrong story from the start, and I make assumptions, and I turn out to be totally wrong. Or I don't believe the right people, and I do believe the wrong people, and things like that. And so that book is about my mishaps as an historian, my misadventures. And the point of it is that it was in those moments when I was so wrong that I actually turned the corner and got a new insight that was really critical.
Yeah. That's that's what's I think great about that last book though, is because that what you said, the lie at the middle. It's because I guess at the core of history is just telling a story, and it's somebody's perspective, but admitting whose perspective it is, and that it's not always perfect.
Right.
So that's
Yeah, right. You have to be willing to delegitimize your own voice, your own authority, and I think the reason why readers say, "Oh, that's so boring," is because they're not bored, as they're annoyed. And they're annoyed because they're being talked down to, because the writer isn't taking them seriously as a thinker and telling them, every last thing to think. That tone is what makes it feel boring. And if we admit that we're just human, it might be more interesting.
It's a hard
to
truth,
read.
though. It's a hard truth to talk about what that means.
Well, and especially in this era of fake news
Yeah,
and questioning
Yeah.
like climate science and all kinds of science, right? That
it doesn't make me feel good.
right, to say, yeah,
Right.
I'm a supposed expert, but I make
Right.
mistakes and I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm not the final voice of authority. This is really
Yeah.
just, I've done a ton of research on this
Yeah.
topic, but it's just my opinion,
Right.
just my take on it.
So maybe for a final question, we can ask you what's next?
Mm.
What's your next project? What are you working
Well, this
on?
is important for Southern history.
Oh, good.
No, it's not actually. I'm writing a
Oh,
history
man.
of the Chernobyl zone, and
Okay.
specifically, and maybe in some ways it is important for Southern history in strange
Yeah.
ways, in that what I found when I was researching this book about the first two plutonium factories in the world is that there are a lot of people, both in the farmers in eastern Washington and farmers in Siberia, who are telling me the same thing about their health problems.
Mm.
And that they have this strange sort of bouquet of health symptoms that were unspecific and hard to diagnose.
Yeah.
And the scientists, the doctors at both places were like, well, they're not really sick. They just think they're sick. They've got radiophobia, this kind of stuff.
Oh.
So I wanted to know if that was really true, and I found that at the Chernobyl records, there was just a ton, 4 million people were exposed. There's just a lot of material about health. And so I went, and I've been working in those records and in the records of the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment to find out like what the vectors were. And so why is this important is that, after the time of testing of nuclear bombs, radiation spread around the globe, and it's in all of our bodies. We all have some cesium and some plutonium. And if we live anywhere near a nuclear power plants daily emit radioactivity,
Yeah.
especially within a 5-kilometer zone around them. And that radioactivity gets into the water and gets into the food sources. And so as we are in an age when, one of the chief characteristics of the Anthropocene is that geologists 1,000 years ago are going to look back and they're going to take a core sample of Earth, if they still exist, and they're going to find, starting in 1945, these new man-made radioactive isotopes that are still going to be there 1,000 years from now. And they're going to find it in the bodies of our animals, of our livestock, and in human bodies.
Yeah.
You're going to find it everywhere. So I think it's good to know what that means for us
Yeah.
in terms of humans and in terms of our environment.
Well, sounds exciting.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading that one too.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to us.
Yeah, it's great.
All right.